Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm Agus Ramirez, and this is Season 2. We're back from the long, much needed break and ready to continue our exploration into the hidden worlds of Southeast Asian women with diverse topics and interviews centered on the colonial period before World War II. Today we're talking about Filipino girlhood in American Colonial Manila, 1908 to 1939. Girls' studies or girlhood studies is a developing field of historical research in the Philippines, says Tala Wong of the Ateneo de Manila University. Her MA thesis on Filipino girlhood in American Colonial Manila explores the emergence of the Filipino girl and by doing so aims to give her a voice long denied in Philippine history and historiography. Educational materials and print media from 1908 to 1939 reveal that girlhood was an ideological battlefield for adults, colonial and local, male and female. In this episode, we're going to find out what it is about girlhood that makes for such a vibrant discourse. Welcome, Tala.
Hello, everybody.
Hi. A bit of your background. You are a history instructor.
Yes,
How
I
long
think
have
I'm
you
a I
been
think I'm a lecturer actually.
lecturer? And how long
Yeah,
have you been lecturing?
my gosh, like 9 years.
Right. And then this has been in Ateneo the entire time.
Yeah,
Right. Okay. And so, what inspired you to write this thesis? Where did this idea come from?
actually, I don't know if she knows it, but it was because of my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And it was specifically because she told us when we were growing up, because I have two younger sisters. And when we were growing up, she was always on her case about knowing how to do certain household chores properly, like folding clothes, knowing how to do the laundry, the dishes, setting the table, and stuff like that. And she would always say it was because we were girls. And
Mm-hmm.
then at some point, I don't know when, I was probably really young, I asked her, why doesn't dad have to do these kinds of things? And why doesn't he have to learn how to do these kinds of things? And she's like, well, he's a guy. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, huh, why is that? Why are we like why are me and my sisters expected to learn how to do these household related things and my dad gets a free pass? And that is the spark, honestly, that set me on this long, very long journey to writing this thesis and uncovering all of these stories about girlhood in the past. So
So
you
this,
never know. You
yeah.
never know where your MA thesis or your dissertation topic is going to come from.
So something so simple as seeing sort of an imbalance in your household led you on this journey to several forms of literature that you looked at for this thesis. So first things first, what is a girl and what is girlhood?
Okay, so actually, and this is something that I also mentioned in the thesis because that's what we're gonna be talking about. Girlhood is a very nebulous topic. Like, it's so hard to pin down. Even girlhood scholars have a hard time agreeing on what makes a girl. So, for the purposes of my thesis, I used some legal documentation, I used some laws about marriage and from dating to the Spanish colonial period. And generally, what I say in my work is that a girl is a young female who is not married and does not have children. And usually she is under the age of 25. And it's very broad when you look at the literature because some documents will say girls, they will specifically use the word girls and they'll refer to women, like females who are like 12 years old. And when you look at magazine articles or magazine advertisements, you'll see um, write ups or like copy that is asking for submissions for girls, and then they'll give an age range, and then sometimes it goes up to like 25 years old. So the top, like what the definition of girlhood is very contentious, and it really varies depending on the girlhood scholar that you're asking. But for me, that would be how I defined it: an unmarried woman, young woman who does not have children and is under the age of 25.
And for the purposes of this study, you looked at mostly Christian females of Filipino ancestry.
Yes. To further
So
like set
mhm.
brackets on what a girl is according to my work.
So you begin this thesis talking about the physical isolation that most women experienced throughout history. So you mentioned the tradition of the binukot to the seclusion in monasteries during the Spanish period. How did this mindset affect what we know about girls and girlhood? This sort of passive, um, sort of onlooker in history, never really at the forefront.
I think it's a very out of sight, out of mind thing. Like that definitely affected how much we do know about girls during this period of history, during the Spanish colonial period, because um, a lot of a lot of young women are studying, but they're cloistered and they're not really writing about themselves. So even if they do know the basics of how to read and how to write, they're not applying it in a self-interested way. And because of that, I think our knowledge today of girlhood during that period suffers. So I would say that seclusion, like seclusion, and maybe the lack of a medium in which to write, maybe a lack of self interest in putting down putting down their life stories into physical writing. That definitely affected how little we know of girls today.
There's a lot of ground to cover here. There's a lot of history. So I'm just gonna pick out certain things that jumped out to me. You wrote of the Spanish period that the body was considered a site of sin and temptation by
Yeah.
the Spanish friars, and the girl or a woman's body even more so. Can you give us examples of what that means for the Philippine context?
So for example, when it comes to fashion, the way that pre-colonial Filipinos were described was very shocking to the Spanish colonizers and foreign visitors when they arrived here, because they were like, why are they wearing so little? Why aren't they as covered up as the women back home in Europe? So that was especially very scandalizing, because they're like, oh no, ankles, oh no, legs. These are things that should be for the Spaniards, things that should be covered up. And that leads into like a whole other discussion of Spanish colonial fashion and religion, like what religious women wore during that time. But it was pretty much the Spanish applying their value system, especially when it came to modesty and fashion, to foreign Filipino bodies. So when the Spaniards come, you see a transition in how people are dressed. There are, no more bahags, or if there are bahags, the top part is covered, and women are more conscious about their private parts. And you see that you can't really see breasts anymore. They're like everything is covered up.
So you noted things like the link to fashion when the Spanish came here. We began to wear tapis, panuelo, the veil, but there was a disconnect between the imposed Spanish modesty on women and a cultural propensity for Filipino women to actually be in public life, because
Exactly.
women had jobs that were in the public eye. They did not stay at home. They were cigarette vendors, cigarera, vendedora, tendera, bordadora, costurera. So, uh, how did that affect growing up in that period?
So okay, so this is actually super interesting because, like I said, there are restrictions on dress, or there are like guidelines on how to dress modestly. but there's also this group of women who are very visible and out and about, and they have, like you mentioned, so many of these very public facing jobs. And like, I didn't go too much into it, but I would hazard a guess that class would probably play a role in all of this. Like, if you're a middle class to a if you're a middle or higher class lady, there are certain moral and social expectations of you. And it seems to me, and this is not something I've done extensive research on, but this would be my best guess, that if you are of a lower work, if you're of the working class, that's not really expected as much of you.
Another important thing I saw here was the role of education, and Spanish colonial education was largely for Spanish girls and mestizas, so Filipino girls would have to wait until 1863 to enjoy widespread public schooling. Can you give us a more context? What was education for girls like at the time?
It would be generally the same as what the boys were learning in public school. So that was uniform, in the sense that they were learning how to read and write and count.
And I think a lot of Catholic teachings also in school at the time.
Definitely, yeah, because that would still be like, even if this was a liberal policy to educate everybody in the Philippines, it was still, under uh, the Catholics, the Spanish.
And so there was a passage of a royal decree that called for the establishment of a network of primary schools, and they wanted both boys and girls to be not merely proper, but ones that were also good and virtuous in accordance with Catholic teachings. So, as we know, that changes very rapidly with the coming of the Americans. And so, really, the focus of your thesis is American Colonial Philippines, which you said was an especially interesting period for Filipino girls. So, how did this Mission Civilizatriz, or the civilizing mission of the US, impact the Filipino girls?
It introduced uh, quote unquote progressive American values to Philippine society, and by extension to Filipino girls. It also introduced ideas of like quote unquote modernity, and this notion of how to be a civilized person. Civilized, of course, by the definition of Americans. And these were things that were, through lessons in school and through other means, taught to Filipino girls.
So, one thing you mentioned was the Gibson girl, who was a sign of a modern progressive civilization as opposed to a static society.
Mhm.
And so I was very interested uh, to learn that when the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 took place, they actually took Visayan, so-called Visayan Gibson girl types to be exhibited there.
Yeah. And this was, of course, I think everyone knows about the very infamous St. Louis World's Fair exposition when it comes to Filipino representation, where they showed our indigenous people in their quote unquote natural habitats. And to contrast how backwards we were, sorry, to contrast how progressive the Philippines was becoming under colonial rule, they had a band playing American standards. They had children saying their ABCs, and apparently there were also, yeah, Visayan Gibson girls, to show that, hey, American culture has taught even our girls how to be more American, how to be more progressive and civilized according to American standards.
And I guess the juxtaposition of the so-called Visayan Gibson girl types with the dog meat eating exhibits at the time must have been a very jarring image that really sold the idea that American colonial rule was doing something great
Yeah.
in the Philippines. So I'm going to go back to education. The census of the Philippine Islands for 1918 which was a decade after the establishment of the state university, reveals that of the 3,336 students, 618 of them were girls, and
Mhm.
English was a medium of instruction. Can you share some interesting things about education during this time?
Something that I find interesting is the even in the earliest years of American colonial education, what Filipinos associated, and I guess what American colonial officials and representatives here considered civilized was a knowledge of English.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were well versed in English, if you were knowledgeable in English enough to speak fluently without making mistakes, to be able to express yourself verbally in written form cleanly in English, you were considered a very alta person. You were considered a very, no, not alta, but like a civilized person, a very modern person, someone who was very with the times. And I think this is not obviously connected strictly to girls. And I think that's something interesting because we still have that mindset today.
Mm-hmm. Something
Uh,
that has endured, yes.
and the fact that we're conducting this interview in English.
Well, that's also because most of the listeners of the podcast are actually outside the Philippines. So,
Mm,
so much like more than 60% of the people who listen are Filipinos who are born abroad or just general, people who like history but are not necessarily Filipino. Those, so it is encouraging in a way that there's a lot of interest in it, but there's also that the way that we're so comfortable expressing ourselves in English is something that has endured. In the thesis, there was a line: with a good education in English, any child, even poor children of laborers, could succeed in becoming professionals if they were bright and studied hard. So it's sort of like I guess this is a parallel to an American dream that
oh, yeah. Hmm.
so there was that transplantation, but you could only succeed if you knew English. And there are remnants of that today.
Oh, yeah.
Also, there was an Act number 74 in 1901, um, free public education to both boys and girls who were now also free to pursue higher education in liberal arts, law, pharmacy. I'm gonna go back to pharmacy later because I noticed something very interesting about that.
Hmm.
Um, well, though boys consistently outnumbered girls, um, there was a quote from a colonial official that I wanted to discuss. Within a few years, the people will, without doubt, have learned that it is as important to educate the girls as it is the boys.
Hmm.
So, and there were you had a very long list of all these home economics guidebooks
Yeah.
that were present at the time.
Hmm.
Um, so tangentially, my great grandmother, I was looking through her things, and I saw a cookbook that was produced, I believe, at CEU or
Hmm.
a similar university, which was dedicated to her. And the introduction of that cookbook said that this cookbook is to help the young woman fulfill her most important role in life, which is managing the nutrition of the home. And so when I was reading all the passages from the guidebooks, I was reminded I have a book like this. I've seen a book like this. So which goes back to why you wrote this thesis in the first place, which I didn't know, but um well, the manuals published by the Department of Public Instruction did not merely mean to instruct Filipino girls in how to properly manage a home, but rather how to properly manage a home as an American girl and a woman, as American woman would. Um, And then the other thing after education was sanitation.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that a bit?
Tangent. Going back to what you said about your great grandmother's cookbook, my sister is actually doing her master's thesis on colonial cookbooks as a tool of colonization.
Uh, that's an interesting topic because there's a lot of value setting. It's not just food. It's not just a recipe.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's your duty. It's your work.
And you see how material culture changes over time as you read cookbooks from like the late 1800s, 1890s to the 1900s to 1920s. You see how ingredients, even instructions, change over time, and what kinds of dishes are being served also changes over time. Wala lang, I just was reminded after you mentioned your great grandmother's cookbook, and I couldn't find a place to butt in.
But
Sorry.
also, but also, I noticed that many of the things that were discussed in these guidebooks or these cookbooks, which you deal with in the idea of the domestic economy, a
Hmm.
lot of them were very practical.
Yeah.
Some of them, I was like, maybe they should have taught me that. Maybe that should have been mentioned in my education at some point. You know, things like how they would how they would make soap or get stains out, or
Yeah.
it's like some of these. I mean,
It's
not just for girls, right?
like I was going through it again, and they actually teach you how to do basic first aid, and not just like how to make someone feel better when they have the flu, because that's also taught, but how to like set bones.
Yes,
I was
yes,
like,
there was
wow.
basic first aid, and that's valuable not just for girls.
That's for
Um,
valuable for everybody.
yeah, everybody, and many of children today, I think, would be would really benefit from
Would
some of
benefit.
this. Would really
Yeah.
benefit from some of this practical education, but um, in the context of American colonial education, it was really setting these values up, and that brings us to sanitation because the Filipino girl, it appears, was the main agent of the sanitation measures and doctrines of American cleanliness.
Oh, so I found it interesting because okay, nobody's done this, so this was a lot of like writing this thing was just um searching blindly in the dark for knowledge. And what I was able to find was that a lot of the ideals of domestic science or euthenics or home ec, however you want to call it, came from three main writers. Uh, Three main writers in England and the United States. So these are Catherine Beecher, Isabella Beaton, and Ellen Richards. So these three ladies form not just the basis of women's education in the 19th century, but also ideas of home economics or domestic science. And in doing so, they kind of created what the ideal girl slash woman should be.
Hmm.
And a big part of understanding domestic science or home economics is that everything is on the girl. The girl has
Mhm.
to know every little thing about the house because in one of the texts, I think it's the 1908 Domestic Science Handbook, they say that how the housekeeper needs to be the best educated, the most skilled, the most intelligent member of the family. So,
Mhm.
no pressure to girls out there. And this was needed. She needed to be the most educated because she was the one who was going to educate everybody else. She was the one who was going to tell her parents who couldn't understand English, who didn't go to school, okay, mom and dad, this is how you make whitewash. This is how you treat tuberculosis. This is how you
Mhm.
set a bone. She was the one who's going to teach her parents. She was the one who's going to teach her brothers and sisters. And when she had her own family, she was going to teach her own family what she learned in her domestic science or home ec classes as as well. And in doing so, she was going to help create a better nation. She learned how to be a good mom and housewife. She could then pass on what she learned to her family, who would then become good citizens. And once we have this nation of good citizens, you have a nation of people who are ready to handle their own destinies and fates and who are ready for self governance. So, this idea of governance of the self is intrinsically tied, at least in the literature, to governance of the nation, which I think is really cool.
I just remembered there's this Facebook group. It's called um, Eldest Daughter in an Asian Household.
Oh my god, did you
And
see the shirt?
I'm just realizing that this idea of the eldest daughter doing everything has
Oh god.
very deep roots in education, in colonial education. So
Yeah.
um, I'm definitely sending this episode to that group after this.
Also, my favorite of the, I'm not sure if you read it, but my favorite talaga, and this has never left my mind in 5 years, like ito lang yung natandaan ko, was they had this experiment or this like school activity where they had to blind taste test all of these different household substances. Okay, sounds sketchy.
So they had to figure out like, with is this salt or is this something else? And
Yeah, is
so
this
this
like
would be
household cleaner or is this tea?
and in the age before the internet, you are literally keeping people alive with this
They're pretty
knowledge.
much Wikipedia, yeah.
So sanitation was actually a pretty big part of your discussion because proper hygiene and sanitation needed to be learned and honed by Filipino girls. And it was interesting to me that sometimes it would be at odds with culture. For example, um, the American knowledge is do not sleep on the floor, but Filipinos would sleep on buri mats. Don't eat with your hands, but don't eat with your hands on the floor. But typically, we eat on the floor. We use our right hand for um, getting the food, and these cultural aspects became superstitions that had to be eradicated.
Yeah, because it's again the application of Western values to Filipino bodies, and there are many accounts of Filipinos and American health officials not seeing eye to eye. A good resource for that would be, is it that kind of podcast where I'm allowed to give sources
Yes,
or?
of course. Yes.
Okay, so I would totally recommend An American Doctor's Odyssey by Dr. Victor Heiser. He was
Mhm.
stationed here and in India. And one of my favorite anecdotes from An American Doctor's Odyssey is the time that there was an outbreak of, I want to say, bubonic plague in
Mhm.
Manila. If I'm remembering correctly, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague, and he had the idea, okay, so we need to lessen the rat population in Manila. So let's let's put up a reward for rat tails, okay? Because one rat tail equals a dead rat, and
Mhm.
we'll price it like a certain way. And of course, what did Filipinos do? The
They bred rats,
enterprising,
didn't they?
they bred rats and then they
Knew
just
it.
cut off the tails and then they sold them to the Bureau of Health, and that didn't obviously fix the problem. So it's Dr. Heiser's book is full of very fun
Yeah.
anecdotes like that about Filipino responses to uh, Westerners, particularly the Americans, imposing their values and health policies on us.
Mhm. They think they're smart, but hmm.
But Filipinos smarter.
Mhm.
The truth, they say, is out there. Trouble is, the truth sometimes can be bland and uninteresting. Subscribe to Dark Theory. Dark Theory is a self produced Filipino podcast that takes you down a rabbit hole of mystery, conspiracy, and dark, twisted tales that blur the boundaries of what you know to be real. Subscribe to A Little Darkness. Listen to Dark Theory, available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Anchor.
In the past, all writers who have attempted to make a relatively comprehensive survey of Philippine conditions always had a word or two to say on the enviable position which women in the Philippines have for centuries enjoyed. But they usually limited their comments to a word or two. It is only recently, very recently, that the subject of woman has become a question, and today it is recognized as a question of primary importance, one which in its complexity presents phases that call for the greatest consideration. Tarsila Malabanan, University of the Philippines, 1916. An important figure you mentioned in the thesis was Maria Paz Mendoza Guazon. She
Yes.
she seems to be like a headmistressy type.
She
Um,
in my mind, when I was reading about her, she was kind of goals because she was the first woman to graduate from the UP College
mhm.
of Medicine in 1912. She was technically therefore the first Filipino doctor, and she was also the first woman to become full professor at UP. So in
Mhm.
that sense, I'm into it. Like the professional aspect, I'm into it. Her what she says, however, not so into it.
It's just that she was a product of her time, and she was sort of trapped in the what she wanted to be, what she wanted girls to be, and what they could be to her knowledge. It was like there's so much tension, and she said, and I quote, "Girls had to be positive, pleasant, and pleasing at all times in
Oh
their
my god, I
manner
have
of
so much to
dress,
say about
in
this.
their bodily gestures, and in their habits." And I thought, ooh, she would not like me.
Right when I was reading her book, my ideal Filipino girl, I was like, I am not the ideal Filipino girl. Okay, can I just say, like, my favorite part is when she says, so, for the people who are listening, The Ideal Filipino Girl was a book that Paz Mendoza Guazon wrote, and it was obviously a guidebook written by a Filipina who had been educated under the American colonial education system, and she was writing about what she felt were her ideal qualities in Filipino girls. It wasn't just her writing; she also asked like a lot of very illustrious figures at the time, like I think Manuel Rojas wrote there as well. So she was asking people to write what their ideal Filipino girl was. And these are all, I could gather that all of the people writing in were adults and definitely not Filipino girls. And she has this part where she has like a list of don'ts, and you're not supposed to laugh at someone's defects
Mhm.
or infirmities. So like if
That's good
someone
advice.
that's good
Mhm.
advice, right? You're not allowed to use slang. You shouldn't use
Mhm.
slang, especially Americanisms like gosh or whoa, something like that.
Mhm. You have to
And
be
then
formal.
you have to be, prim and proper, PNP. And also, this is my favorite, and this is why I knew that I was not the ideal Filipino girl, because you should never allow people to pay for you. Because, and she puts this in parenthesis, I think, you are not a beggar.
Oh.
And I was like, well, okay.
She had ideas. It was it was
She had
such a
ideas.
it was such a tension. It was like she wants somebody to be independent, but at the same time not so independent. It's like a you know, she one really good sentence that encapsulates that is how you should behave in a classroom. She said, "Be quiet enough to be attractive, but loud enough to be heard by your teacher."
I like that because she talks a lot about sound, about
Mm,
voice, about loudness
mm.
in her entire book, because you're also not allowed to do certain things. Oh my god, I forgot to mention. You're not allowed to giggle or cry
Yes.
because those are not appropriate things for girls to do. And this is also my favorite. even if your life is in peril, this is almost a direct quote, you cannot scream or shriek. Okay, so even if you're being held up at knife point, even if you're being dragged away into an L300, you are not allowed to scream.
Well, that's just bad survival instincts, but to anybody listening, please do scream if you are
Make as
being.
much, be loud, occupy space, guys,
Please carry an alarm with you.
or
These
like a
are not.
whistle. Yeah.
um, she also said, she also advised girls express in your face and eyes the feeling of deep interest, of good nature, of sincerity, but never of hatred, contempt, and selfishness.
I really want to do like a live read of this entire book,
Maybe
and then
maybe we should try. We should try for a week to do everything she says.
oh my god, I would fail like the very first day.
Because I'm pretty sure, like she when she says girls had to be positive, pleasant, and pleasing at all times. Ooh,
Oh no, that's
I'm.
like, have you met us? Obviously, Paz has not met us.
She has not met you or me or any of her friends. Hi, Mia.
Hi, Mia.
Okay, which is not a bad thing, by the way. It's like,
We
hmm,
love Mia, and we love us.
yes. So the domestic economy. So this is where I met Catherine Beecher and Ellen Swallow Richards.
Hmm.
They had um, again, they had housekeeping manuals which championed the inclusion of housekeeping and the household arts.
Yeah.
Um, but they also recruited and trained female teachers so that women could start to earn a living, which was not possible before.
Hmm.
And then in the domestic economy, the ideal Filipino girl recognized that her own work of turning the house into a home was significant and as important as a man's work. So um, I like that there's recognition of reproductive labor
Yeah.
in their ideas. It's just that it was an early, like the early roots of reproductive labor, because it was very um this is your place in the world. And
Yeah, you're
so
a supporting character.
yes, you are not the main character in the narrative. um and your personal point of view must be supplanted by the broad view of majority welfare. And oh, here's a really interesting. I think this was Ellen Swallow Richards. The maintenance of harmonious relations was key to the ideal Filipino girl's life. Her role was to ensure that nothing that she said or did caused offense to anyone within the family, school, or community. In order to accomplish this, she needed to learn the values of cooperation, order, and cleanliness.
See, and you can see remnants of that in the household manuals that that Filipino girls do study here. That you have to be cooperative, you have to be kind, you have to be pleasing, you have to work with others, you have to ensure harmony, and that is something that Filipinos really love.
There's a lot of pressure on women to sort of be the harmonious, to keep the peace, to um and when again it's like, again, the eldest daughter in the Asian household, when you look at these, then the complaints of um girls growing up in with siblings and things like this, it's always, you have to be the patient one, you have to pick up after
You
everyone,
have to be the mature one.
you have to be the mature one.
And
And
it
mm,
reminds sorry it reminds me that women, like especially like you, like going off of what you said, eldest daughters in Asian households always have to do both the physical labor and the emotional labor.
mm,
Like the majority of that is on you.
the intellectual labor too, you have to be the tutor to
And yeah, you also have to be
yeah. And you
and in
have
the
to manage the finances and
yeah, and in the context of the Filipino girl in the American colonial period, you also had to teach your family about what you learned in school.
mhm,
So they wouldn't run off and develop tuberculosis or whatever.
keeping the society alive, quite literally.
Literally, like if we weren't around, everybody would die. That is the sense that I'm getting from all of
Yeah,
these, yeah,
the
household
guidebooks, right?
manuals.
There were also passages about, of course, how to behave in relation to men. Um, and it was always a secondary role. It's always a lot of passages about keeping yourself small. Not necessarily, but they completely acknowledge that you are just as smart, just as tough, just as strong, but don't tell them that.
Yeah, but you have to stay at home and maintain the harmony and be quiet and be attractive enough or be loud enough that your teacher hears you, but not loud enough that people complain that you're too loud.
And so, modern girls had a bitter pill to swallow that, in spite of their education and societal contributions, men still believed that the government of the people, for the people, and by the people was actually a government of men, by and for men alone. Girls were expected to cultivate their intellects, yet behave like fools, to have keen eyes, but to show you not, to tie your articulate tongue and suppress the throbbing of your heart, to live a lifeless life.
God, you know, I was
That
so
was good
emotional.
writing. That was
I
great
was
writing.
I was so emotional writing this because I was like, "Oh my god, all the injustices to women in the past." And then
And the
yeah.
present and
And
the
that persists in the present because you can still see people thinking like this in the present.
and even with when, because as we know a woman is running for president, I hear it a lot in real life.
Oh my
She
god.
can't possibly be president. She's a woman.
Oh my
Okay.
god. Like
Sometimes
in
I don't argue. It's like, oh,
2021, come on
sometimes,
guys.
yeah. Sometimes people are too far gone and you're like, this is not, I can't.
Yeah,
um,
just yeah.
so going back, the problem with an idealized girl, as you said, as with any idealized construct, is that they ultimately fail to live up to these high moral standards. And I was so proud of Paz Marquez Benitez, who is an amazing writer.
Red
Um,
stars, we love it.
Dead Stars. And she was actually the captain of Manila's first girls basketball team,
Oh my
and
god, I love that story.
she played tennis in European dress, which was a scandal at the time.
Yes.
You're showing your knees. Okay.
Oh my god, legs. My eyes.
And so there was backlash. There were people who were trying to argue against this.
Mm-hmm.
Guillermo B. Guevara said that they will not abide by by the hearth, but demand the single standard. They want careers, not babies. They want the ballot. They want everything the men have, and their avidness to be on the same footing with men. They would even wear pants. Like hearing this today is, it's a journey.
This was that issue about, so there was a controversy, I think in the 30s, where girls wanted to wear PE clothes that were like more shorts and t-shirt rather than like full length dresses.
Hmm.
And that was like front page news because people are like, look at them, they're becoming too American, they are too modern. And you have all of these thought, thought pieces like, what happened to the Dalaga of the past?
And it's just that you have to keep reminding yourself this is a product of their time. This was a period of great change. People were struggling with ideas. So when you got to the part about the pioneers of this period, so
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, thank you. So there was a lot going on at my alma mater, the University of the Philippines.
Woo!
So there was the interesting. I did not hear of this when I was studying there, but there was a UP Women's Club.
Yes,
So
very
there was
active.
Virginia Oteza, who eventually became the first woman in Baguio to be elected vice mayor and councilor.
Mm-hmm.
There was Daisy P. Ontiveros, who founded the Barangay Theater Guild in 1939, and Corazon Juliano, who in 1954 became the second woman appointed judge at the Court of First Instance and later the Agrava Board, the fact finding missions. Um, And Nelly Burgos became one of the presidents of the largest women's organization in the state university. And some of them, women at this time, they began to live independently of their families. Maria Salome Marquez and Ursula Sevilla. There were artists, Angela Manalang Gloria, Trinidad Tarosa Subido, Edith Tiempo. They became employed as telephone operators, sales girls, ushers, and um, what I remember is I'm gonna go back to pharmacy. I did not know that that was considered the ideal job for a
Yeah,
woman at the
because you could
time.
work from home,
Hmm.
and a lot of people likened it to just cooking. So you could just like do it at home, and while you were working, you could also look after your kids and do all the household chores. So you were having, you had it all if you were a female pharmacist,
So there was teaching and
of course.
pharmacy was pretty much the two things, um and then they became telephone operators and sales girls and ushers because of the feminine voice that they were trained to have. um so there's a change here. I could see like this must have been exciting and frustrating, and um there were also actresses now that were in the mainstream. Rosa del Rosario was the first Darna, and Tita Duran,
Of course.
and so which brings us to the advice columns,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
which were fascinating because there were so many things that were not taught in school, so many things that were taboo. And so Filipino girls from the middle and upper classes in Manila from 1908 to 1939 who could afford I'm guessing, the magazine subscription. I'm guessing this was
Hmm.
not free.
Yeah,
Um,
you had to pay for it.
Filipino girls were not the virgins that history or their parents, their relatives, Mrs. Fuller, Mrs. Butt, and Mrs. Mendoza Guanzon hoped them to be.
Surprise.
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 I like this. There was a columnist there. Her name was Yvonne. No last name given, but
Yeah.
ultimately, the attempts of the madres to keep girls in check would fail, as girls of our age, Yvonne notes with no small amount of pride, are smarter than the smartest mother superior.
I love that. I love that. It shows you how crafty girls have to be to survive.
And it's just, and it is worthy of note that while many Filipino men, young and old, spoke of their ideal Filipino girl, things started turning around because Filipino girls also began writing about their ideal Filipino men.
Oh, I love that too.
There are, of course, many controversies, from employment to Western fashion and beauty products to consumerism, wearing shorts when you're playing sports. Um, and girls were sent to dormitories where they were not under so much supervision. And so they became crafty in the areas of courtship and romance. And they began questioning marriage. That was an interesting development, too, because now they could lose something. They would lose their freedom, perhaps be tied to the home, and some of them might not want that.
Yeah, I it's interesting to see through the advice columns that I researched, the problems that girls face today are still problems that I think that, they're just tied to our biology, I guess. Because the same considerations, the same questions are there, like do I have to get married? Do I
Mhm.
want to get married? We're thinking about these things. We're thinking about romance. We're thinking about our sexual partners. We're still thinking about these things. We're still concerned about these things as women today. And what I like about the advice columns is that they're so deeply personal,
Mhm.
very, very personal. They ask about all sorts of things. And there were different advice columns dedicated to different things. So there was an advice column just for health stuff, and there are advice columns for romance and other relationships. And this was like Google for them at that
Yeah.
time, because you could not Google search in 1930, am I pregnant? You would and you couldn't go to a doctor, so you would write anonymously into this advice column and ask, and you give your symptoms and wait for your answer to be published. And you couldn't ask if you were uncomfortable talking about menstruation, something that is so commonplace to us today, and you didn't want to talk about it with your mom, or your mom didn't want to talk about it. Your only way to get information judgment free was to go to these advice columnists.
And so they would ask things about my period is late, or there's too much pain. I'm experiencing too much pain during my periods. Is this normal? Should I just quit school and go back to the province? And
Yeah.
there was no Google, as you said.
There's no Google for that. You had to go to these advice columnists. And it wasn't just girls. I also found it interesting that it's not just girls writing, it's also moms.
Oh,
So
right. How
yeah.
to raise their girls.
Yeah, because these I think it's important for people to understand the moral authority that these advice columns held for people during this time, again, because it's so hard to get information to very specific things. The only way to do that is to, if you don't want to talk about it with people you write to an advice column. So there was one woman who said, my daughter is 13 years old. How do I raise her properly? And how do I tell her that she's going to meet physical and moral dangers, that she will have menstruation? I'm quoting from the actual thing, that she will have menstruation and that she should be careful in her relations with the opposite sex. Please instruct me on this matter. And it tells you too that these are not things that are taught to girls during that time. So this mom probably doesn't even know herself, and she is expected to raise her daughter in a, I guess, like a moral, spiritual way.
And during a time of great change where there are probably more opportunities that are open to the daughters. And of course, there's also that fear. How are they going to go out into the world that might be hostile to them? And so it
Exactly.
might be easier to just stay at home. And so the girls growing up in this period, I don't have to. So there's that, really just this intense. So it's so fraught for all of these great thinkers to come out. And um, again, so many passages from that you cited here. It's just I just found myself completely agreeing, like, yes, yes, you should definitely be asking these questions about your life and your future. um so
And these are
mm,
a great way to learn about other women,
mhm,
because I'm forgetting who wrote about it, but I think it was Paz Mendoza Guazon or Paz Marquez Benitez. Oh no, I'm confusing them. But
mhm,
one of them said that we don't like to, like, Filipino women don't like to write about ourselves, especially when it comes to
mm,
autobiographies. We
mhm,
are, for some reason, hesitant to write about ourselves, and maybe that's a testament to how other thinking we are, how we always think about others before ourselves,
mhm.
especially as eldest daughters in an Asian family. But
Which is apparently a very has very deep historical roots that
apparently,
um I guess that would give many people more context as to, because if you're not the eldest daughter in an Asian household, you don't think about these things. These are very unique circumstances where you're expected. There's so much pressure.
right? That's what you should title this episode.
Never mind American colonial period. Let's talk about
Yeah,
eldest daughters in an Asian household, American colonial period edition.
exactly. So as I was saying before I derailed myself, these advice columns are actually a good way to find out about the mindsets of girls, and these women's magazines, these girls magazines like the Women's World, which I know, ironic title, but it's directed towards college aged girls. these are good ways to find out about the voices that perhaps were hesitant to write autobiographies but had no hesitation about writing to an anonymous advice column. And it's through these advice columns that I think we have a better picture, and through the women's world actually, that we have a better picture and understanding of the mindsets of girls during this time period. Because not the women that you mentioned, I don't think the majority of them wrote proper memoirs or autobiographies of their own. So the only clues we have about their lives, if we're to look at public records, are these are
Advice
these
columns.
either these advice columns or these articles written about them in Women's World or other similar published material.
As I was reading, I really had a feeling of look how far, how different our lives are now, where you and I are on a podcast that I produce from my bedroom. It's just, and we have no problems with writing about our day on social media or um, even submitting our thoughts to newspapers. And it's just so far, not far enough, maybe, but so
Hmm.
far. And it's really interesting to look at how they express themselves in times of in a time of great tension. And there's still um, there's new problems now, but there are so many things we can still learn from what they went through. And so I just really liked this thesis because it examined where did you find these magazines, by the way?
I Okay, so some of them, I think we had one. Okay, so as I'm sure everybody who listens to your podcast knows, you are an academic yourself, so you know the
Hmm.
struggle, and you know the hustle. So in our library in our university, we had, I think, one issue, and of course it lists like the volume number and then the year. So I was like,
Hmm.
okay, so where do I find all of the other issues, because they're around. And
They're
so a
here
lot of
somewhere.
they're here, they must be here somewhere, someone must have a copy. And that led me to the Lopez library.
Right, right.
They have a lot of them. And also
Fascinating.
UP library, I think. So I spent many hours in both of those institutions.
And I guess also because there was a certain class of women who had the privilege to write at this time. It's
Yeah.
like university women, and I would suppose elites who could afford an education here or abroad. So, tip for those who want to do research on girls and girlhood. There are the libraries in Ortigas and UP are good places to start.
Did they move though, the Lopez library? I think they were moving their library, although I'm not super sure.
I have no idea. I've been there once, interestingly enough, for a women's conference. So
It all comes back to
it all
women.
comes back. Um, Anything else you want to say to our listeners?
I just want to say, if you are interested in doing studies on colonial girlhood, hit me up. There are not a lot of people doing research on girlhood. And when I wrote this, I was pretty much like one out of two or three people. And the two other people I know of weren't really doing girlhood, which is why I was able to find so much in the archives. And right, I think, in my opinion, something really fresh. It's an underexplored topic, in my opinion. There is so much to learn about girls, and learning about girls helps us understand why we think about women the way we do today, and that is always so important to know.
Similarly, with this podcast, there was no podcast like it when I started. And remember, if if you're not gonna do it, if the girls out there are not gonna do it, nobody's gonna do it. So
Claim
we
it.
we have to do it ourselves. Let the women do the work.
Yes, take up space, guys.
Learn from. all these narratives. So that's it for Girlhood in the American Colonial Period with Tala Wong. Thank you so much for being here, Tala.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be part of this very groundbreaking podcast.
Producing a podcast like this takes a lot of time and research. If you like what we do, consider joining our Patreon like Christina, Raul, Raymond, Chito, Matt, Shireen, Chanda, Yati, Kara, and Mando, who have been supporting this podcast. Give as little as $1 to get a copy of the show notes with all the references, a shout out at the end of the next episode, and the occasional bonus episode. There's one coming out in the next few weeks. And if you can't join us on Patreon, just tell your friends about this podcast. That works too. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Her Story C Pod. That's Her Story SEA Pod. There's so many more stories to tell, and we're just getting started. This podcast was written, hosted, and edited by Agus Ramirez. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next time. Season 2 is going to be very exciting. Sampay dyan palagi!
They're like everything is covered up.
Can I wait for the barking to stop?
Do you want me to? Do you want me
No.
to repeat that?
No, it's good because I can just mute that from. But why are they barking?
For me, it's the roosters. Like it's like 3 a.m. and I'm trying to record my lecture for class, and I'm like, why is that rooster awake?